Hugh Ross is an astronomer and president of Reasons to Believe, an organization dedicated to demonstrating the compatibility of science and Christianity. Hugh earned a Bachelor of Science in Physics from the University of British Columbia and a Master of Science and PhD in Astronomy from the University of Toronto. For several years, he continued his research on quasars and galaxies as a postdoctoral fellow at the California Institute of Technology. Hugh founded Reasons to Believe in 1986 to bring scientific evidence for Christianity to light. Today, Hugh is the author of multiple books, including Navigating Genesis and Why the Universe is the Way It Is, and speaks on science-faith issues to audiences around the world. Please welcome Hugh Ross.
Well, thank you. Thank you. Well, as you heard, I was educated in Canada. I'm an American now, but I was educated in Canada. And I found out that here they do show and tell in their education. There's none of that in Canada. Okay, but what we're going to do tonight is a little bit of show and tell. You know, in the Bible, it says that everything that God creates is for the purpose of bringing human beings into a redemptive relationship with the Creator of the universe. And in nature, God shows us that the entire universe and every component and every event in the history of Earth and Earth's life is for the purpose of making possible the redemption of billions of human beings. Now, everybody knows the anthropic principle, that the universe has been designed for life. But did you know that you need exponentially more fine-tuning design to have plants and animals as opposed to just bacteria? And you need exponentially more fine-tuning design if you want human beings. But the greatest exponentiation of all is to go from having a planet that has humans on it to having a planet where billions of us can hear the gospel message and respond to that gospel message and give our lives to Jesus Christ. And that's what I'm going to speak about tonight. What kind of planet? I mean, after all, just a couple of days ago, NASA announced that they had found 7 habitable planets. You can go to my Facebook page. They're about the least habitable planets that we've discovered so far. So a lot of my friends said I think NASA was playing a fundraiser, but that's speculation. But literally, every event in the history of our planet, every life form that has ever existed, plays a role in making possible the redemption of human beings. And that's what this book is all about. In the book, I describe several hundred specific events in the history of the earth and specific species of life that are necessary to make possible our redemption. So you really need to be thanking God for cockroaches. You wouldn't be able to hear and understand the gospel. That's another story. I'm not going to talk about that tonight. What I'm going to focus on, because of limited time, is just 3 events that are critical for making possible the redemption of billions of human beings. Number 1, you must be living at the end of a highly fine-tuned ice age cycle. Without ice, none of us would be able to hear and receive the gospel. Our sun must be perfectly middle-aged, and we need extreme climate stability. And each of these is a testimony to God's miraculous intervention on our behalf. Okay, what do we mean by an ice age cycle? Technically, we're in an ice age right now. Anytime the planet's got more than 2% of its surface covered with ice, that's called an ice age. Well, right now, 10% of our planet is covered with ice. We're looking at North America. Right now, 10% of North America is covered with ice. But if you go back 26,000 years, 55% of it was covered with thousands of feet of ice. And that's what we're talking about. An ice age cycle is when you cycle from 10% ice coverage of the planet to 20 to 23% ice coverage. So this is where we are right now. We're in what's called a warm interglacial, but it's still an ice age. And so the ice age cycle looks like this, where about every 100,000 years, you get a warm episode where you only got 10% ice. But for about 90,000 years, you're looking at 20 to 23% ice. And yeah, there's this regular cycle. Every 100,000 years, we have a brief interglacial. Now, in the book, I describe about 20 different reasons why an ice age cycle is critical for billions of us to live on this planet at one time. Because that's the message of the Bible. God did not want to save just a few. He wanted to save billions. I'm only going to have time to give you a couple of reasons. But number one, it takes the melting of ice left over from the last ice age to irrigate the great agricultural plains so that we can grow enough food to feed billions of human beings. So if I were to take it back 26,000 years, this blue region here shows you those parts of the planet where there was at least 1,000 feet thickness of ice. And it's the melting of that ice starting about 20,000 years ago and continuing to this very day that's irrigating the great agricultural plains of China, of India, and here in North America, the ice pack we have in the Rockies is still irrigating the great prairies where we grow most of our food today. Now here's the second benefit. As you're in the height of an ice age, where you've got 20 to 23% ice coverage, it melts very rapidly. As it melts rapidly, the high plateaus get exposed, and the rapid melting causes a powerful wind to blow off of those high plateaus and down onto the low agricultural plains. What that does is it fertilizes those agricultural plains with nutrient-rich dust. And so literally with every ice age cycle, you get a fertilization event. And it's thanks to that fertilization and the water that's still left over from the last ice age that allows us to grow sufficient food to feed nearly 8 billion human beings. Now, why do we need a perfectly middle-aged star? It's because stars are just like human beings. They're unstable when they're young, they're unstable when they're old. They're maximally stable when they're middle-aged. But in the case of stars, you don't get that maximum stability unless they're perfectly middle-aged. You know, for us human beings, it's a fairly long period of stability. But with stars, it's very brief. And a couple of reasons why. Now, first of all the stars that exist, our star has the mass that gives it maximum luminosity stability. So bigger stars and smaller stars are a problem. Just like with these 7 planets they just discovered. The star is way too small to be stable enough. Now, as the sun begins to burn its nuclear fuel, it starts off throwing out huge flares and huge amounts of ultraviolet and X-ray radiation. In fact, the graph of the flare activity looks like this. Now, this is logarithmic. There's about a factor of 1,000,000 difference from the top of this curve and the bottom of this curve. And this dotted line represents where we are right now. And so you can see we're living at that time in the history of the sun where we got the minimum flaring activity, the minimum ultraviolet radiation, and the minimum X-ray radiation. Now, if you're a bacterium, you can handle this much radiation coming off from the sun, but not if you're a human being. You've got to be right there. Moreover, as we physicists have studied the physics of the sun, particularly looking at the neutrinos that are coming out of the sun, it's taught us that the sun entered an extremely stable luminosity phase beginning about 50,000 years ago. And those same neutrinos tell us it's not going to last for more than another 50,000 years. So 40 to 45,000 years from now, we're going to exit this extreme solar luminosity phase. So it tells you there's this really narrow time window in which we got sufficient solar luminosity stability that human beings with a large population and civilization can exist. But this leads to an apparent contradiction, because this doesn't happen until the sun is 4.57 billion years old. But as the sun burns hydrogen into helium, it causes its nuclear furnace to get more efficient. So as the sun is burning, it's getting progressively brighter and brighter and brighter. And this is what the solar luminosity history curve looks like. So that, here we go. It gets bright very quickly as it gains mass, then it loses mass and dims, and then it kicks in nuclear fusion, and it gradually gets brighter and brighter and brighter. And this is where we are right now. Now, for 90% of the history of life on planet Earth, the last 3.8 billion years, there's been no ice at all. So the norm for planet Earth is no ice. We have a few episodes where we got ice ages. But given how bright the sun is right now, there shouldn't be any ice on the planet at all. And yet we've had, right now, we're living in this ice age cycle. But I also want to emphasize the ice age cycle in which we're living right now is incredibly brief. This little thin line here, that's the history of the ice age cycle. So just over the last 500 million years, only this tiny sliver of time have we gone from no ice at all to where we have this cycle running from 10 to 20 to 23% ice coverage. So here's the enigma. How do we get ice on planet Earth when the sun is so very bright, the brightest it's ever been in the history of life on planet Earth? The answer is it took 5 unprecedented, simultaneous tectonic events to cool the planet enough that you could get ice when it's as bright as it is. And remember, it's really the only time because the sun must be 4.57 billion years old for the reasons I've just mentioned. Well, I'm going to take you through these 5 unprecedented tectonic events one at a time. The first one is what happened to Antarctica. It began attached to Australia. It broke off from Australia, but remained attached to South America. Then it broke off from South America and began to speed towards the South Pole. So here it is moving towards the South Pole, but when it gets to the South Pole, it stops moving. It puts on the brakes. So this is where Antarctica is today relative to the South Pole. You can see it's bang on the South Pole. But something else I want you to notice, all around Antarctica is wide open ocean. There's nothing to stop the flow of wind. And so if you remember those sailing novels that you read when you were a child of the Roaring Forties, it's a reference to the zone between 40 and 50 south latitude where the winds always blow at a minimum of 40 miles an hour. And it also causes a powerful ocean current to circulate around Antarctica. That worked to cool the planet, and because of its, cool Antarctica, and because of its location over the South Pole, it caused ice to form. The ice over Antarctica is a relatively recent phenomenon, but it's now thousands of feet thick. Now, one of the properties of ice is it reflects sunlight extremely well. And so the reflection of that sunlight worked to cool the planet. But more than that, this powerful circulation around Antarctica caused a northward current to flow all the way up through the Atlantic Ocean. And it worked to cool the Atlantic Ocean waters. So it was a second cooling effect as a result of the placement of Antarctica far away from any other landmass. Okay, tectonic event number 2 is what happened to Greenland. Greenland began located off of Newfoundland down here. And then it began to move northward, where today it's now the northernmost landmass on the planet. But as it moved northward by 1,100 miles, it moved over what's called a hot plume spot, similar to what we see today in Hawaii, where you got this upwelling lava coming from the interior of the Earth. And what that did is it took Greenland, which had an average land elevation of just a few hundred feet, and made it 8,000 to 10,000 feet. So the combination of the movement of Greenland up towards the North Pole and the elevation of its landmass to 8,000 to 10,000 feet caused a thick pack of ice to form. And again, ice reflects sunlight very efficiently, and that worked to cool the planet. Event number 3 is what happened to Pangaea. Pangaea is a supercontinent that existed 250 million years ago, where Earth only had one continent. Then it began to split up into different continents. But unique to this breakup of continents is the fact that they all tended to go towards the northern hemisphere. Most of the land mass on planet Earth today is in the northern hemisphere. But they also moved in such a way as to enclose the Arctic Sea almost entirely with landmass. And what that did is it cooled the Arctic Sea to a sufficient degree that allowed the polar ice cap to form. So instead of open ocean water over the Arctic Ocean, we now have ice. And ice reflects sunlight more efficiently than open water. So those are the first three. Number 4 is what happened to North America and South America. North and South America, if we go back about 10 million years ago, were well separated from one another. And so warm Pacific Ocean water was able to flow along the equator into the Atlantic, and that warmed the Atlantic. It blunted the impact of the cold water coming up from Antarctica. But then North and South America began to move towards one another. And about 3 million years ago, they moved close enough together to form the Isthmus of Panama. And what that did is it created a barrier preventing warm Pacific Ocean water from coming into the Atlantic, which enhanced the cooling of the Atlantic Ocean as a result of the water flowing up from Antarctica. 4. The 5th one is by far the most dramatic and the most important. It's what happened to the Indian subcontinent. If you go back 70 million years ago, the Indian subcontinent was attached to Madagascar. Then it broke off and it raced towards Asia. Now, what I mean by race is a typical rapid tectonic movement is about 2 centimeters per year. But in this case, it's moving at 22 centimeters per year. So let me demonstrate. A typical rapid tectonic plate movement would be kind of like this. I hate it when people hike that slowly. And then what was really happening with the Indian subcontinent, it was moving like this. And so when it got to Asia, it smashed into Asia with tremendous force. With such tremendous force that it caused the ocean floor between India and Asia to be crumpled up. And those are the Himalayas we see today. There's a reason why you see seashells on top of Mount Everest. It was crumpled up ocean floor. And incidentally, India is still crashing into Asia. The collision is not yet over. Now it's only moving 5 centimeters per year. But that 5 centimeter per year movement ranks as the second fastest tectonic plate movement that we can record in the history of the Earth. It's still incredibly rapid. And the Himalayas are getting taller. Sir Edmund Hillary did not climb the world's tallest mountain. It's 1.5 feet taller today than it was when he climbed it. But it also causes the landmass behind the Himalayas to rise up, the Tibetan Plateau. So the Tibetan Plateau went from about 1,000 feet above sea level. Today, it averages 17,000 feet above sea level. 1 million square miles behind the Himalayas has been pushed up 16,000 feet. And that's caused a store of ice to form over the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. Okay, quick quiz. What's the largest store of ice on planet Earth today? Antarctica. Yeah, by far the largest. What's the second largest? Greenland. What's the third largest? Usually when I say this, people say it's got to be the polar ice cap. The truth is there's a bigger store of ice on planet Earth today over the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau than there is over the Arctic ice cap. It's the third largest store of ice. And again, ice reflects sunlight very efficiently. Only this time we're talking about an ice pack that's not at the poles, is down near the equator. Consequently, the ice over Tibet and the Himalayas reflects sunlight 4 times more efficiently than the ice over the Arctic or over Greenland or over Antarctica. So this is by far the most significant cooling impact that we have on planet Earth. It also explains why, as we look at the last million years where we've had this 100,000-year ice age cycle, how each period where you get ice packing over more than 10%, each one of those ice ages is more severe than the previous. We human beings are living right now after the most severe ice age in the ice age cycle. And the next one that's coming will be more severe than the one we've already experienced. But because we're living after the most severe ice age in the ice age cycle, here we are 14,000 years after the end of the last one, and we still got water flowing off of these glaciers and providing us with the irrigation we need for agricultural land masses. That wasn't the case with previous ice ages because the ice pack wasn't as big. So that's one of the benefits of being at this particular time. Now, we need all 5 of these tectonic events to happen. Take one of them away, you don't get any ice. You need every one of those 5 to get ice. Moreover, they all have to happen simultaneously or you don't get ice. Now, we barely have ice, okay? Because of how bright the sun is, it took these 5 outstanding tectonic events happening simultaneously just to get a small amount of ice. And because of how delicately balanced our planet is between no ice at all and a small amount of ice, it's cyclical. Tiny changes in the orbit of the Earth about the sun explains why we see this cycle between 10% and 23%. So for example, as the Earth orbits about the sun, it has an elliptical shaped orbit, but the ellipticity of the orbit varies with a 100,000-year cycle. When it's more elliptical, it gets warmer. When it's less elliptical, it gets colder. Another impact is the fact that the tilt of our orbit changes very slightly. And again, when it gets more tilted, the climate gets warmer. Less tilted, it gets colder. These are the 2 most predominant cycles. In fact, there are 7 cycles in the orbit of the Earth about the sun, which is why with 7 of these cycles operating, what you get during the ice age is incredibly chaotic temperature variations. So this shows you the temperature variations of the last 4 ice ages. And you can see how the temperature is jumping up and down all the way through these ice ages. And that's because you've got 7 of these cycles that are all out of sync with one another, driving extreme temperature instability. In fact, this is a blow-up of what was happening to the temperature of the planet before the onset of the warm interglacial and right now. And you can see that the temperature was jumping up and down by 24 degrees Fahrenheit in a space of just a few centuries. This is why early humanity was not able to develop a large population or advanced civilization. The temperature was simply far too unstable to enable them to have large specialized farms and specialized agricultural activity. We do have evidence, you'll see it in my book, that early humans living 30 and 40,000 years ago were engaged in sophisticated agriculture, but it was on a very small scale. It had to be because of how radically the temperature was varying. What they were doing is they might have a farm of 2 acres, and they would plant 12 crops, knowing that 8 or 9 of those crops would fail, but they would feed their families in the 3 that would make it, and they had no idea which 3 it would be. Same thing with animal husbandry. They couldn't afford to specialize because of the climate instability. But what happened starting 9,000 years ago is these 7 out-of-sync cycles suddenly all came into sync, bringing about what's referred to as the long, cool summer. So the temperature has risen up, but it stopped short 3 degrees centigrade of what we see in previous maximal temperatures in the Ice Age. But notice, over the last 9,000 years, there's not been a variation any bigger than 2 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's because of the extreme climate stability we've been able to grow enough food to feed billions of human beings. And it's because of that extreme climate stability, we can feed the world's population with only 2% of the population involved in agriculture. During the last ice age, 98% of the population was involved in coming up with food. Today, just 2% or less. And because of that, we are able to have thousands, millions of us involved in engineering, science, medicine, mathematics, technology, and that explains why we have such a rapidly advancing civilization and a great population. Now, when I presented this to my peers in science who are not believers, the most common response I get is, this is just a sheer coincidence that all this happened. I say, well, wait a minute. We're talking 5 simultaneous tectonic events that all happen when the sun is 4.57 billion years old. And we move that by a few million years, in fact, we move it by even a few thousand years, we're in trouble. It's got to be perfectly timed. And you need 7 different variations in the orbit of the Earth to all be in sync. I don't think this is a coincidence. This was planned. And notice that all of these simultaneous events are perfectly synced, not only to serve our physical needs, but to serve our spiritual needs. In this sense, we need the technology we have today in order to take the good news of salvation to all the people groups of the world in sufficient time before the next ice age hits or the next period of climate instability hits. I can tell you this period of extreme climate stability cannot be sustained for very much longer. But God gave us all the means. He gave us the wealth, He gave us the technology, He gave us the biodeposit resources, and He gave us the people power that we can take the good news of salvation to all the people groups of the world. In fact, I quote from my friend Ralph Winter. He's passed away now, but he was a missiologist who said, evangelicals today have the money, the people, and the technology to fulfill the Great Commission in 5 years. All they lack is the motivation. And that's one reason why I wrote my book, is to provide people like you with a motivation, saying, there's no question God has equipped us for this task, and He's done it in a very obvious, miraculous way. We need to get on with the business of fulfilling Revelation chapter 7, verse 9. Before me was a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people, and language. Now, the Greeks had a mathematics system that took their number system up to 1 billion. So I kind of interpret this passage, God intends to save billions of human beings. But in order for God to save billions of human beings, we need a highly fine-tuned designed planet. We need a highly fine-tuned star. In fact, every planet in our solar system must be fine-tuned just right to make possible the existence of billions of human beings on our planet with the technology that people can quickly hear and respond to the gospel of salvation through Jesus Christ. Now, we at Reasons to Believe are a sponsor of this conference for one reason. We want every one of you to become an excited, joyful, passionate, and equipped Christian to bring people to faith in Jesus Christ. Our prayer for each one of you is that you would come away from this conference with a confidence of talking to your non-Christian friends and associates, and with the experience of leading several of them to faith in Jesus Christ between now and the next time we have another conference like this. And I can tell you, as the president of Reasons to Believe, every book we publish is designed to be a tool by itself that an unbeliever can read, and through the reading of that book, come to faith in Jesus Christ. You know, I'm also a pastor, and one thing I tell people in my church, here's a really easy way to begin sharing your faith in an effective way. Think of some non-believer's name that you can give a book to. It can be a book like this one, or any one of the books you see out there at the table. And you need to think about who that non-Christian friend is, and pick on a book you think would be appropriate for them. And just find an opportunity to wrap that up and give it to him or her as a gift. But as you do that, you want to be praying that they would be exposed to the book. And sometimes it takes them a month or two before they even pick it up. But you need to have set in place a plan for follow-up. Take them out to lunch or breakfast, and see how they're doing with the book. And I can tell you, one of my greatest pleasures as being the president of Reasons to Believe is hearing people tell me stories. I read your book 15 years ago, and it brought me to faith in Jesus Christ. And we purposely invited people to this conference who are in the business of writing. And you heard the last two speakers. And so again, I want you to think about who you can give a book to, because I know of no easier way to begin sharing your faith than to put the right book in their hands and to look for an opportunity to follow up and share your Christian faith with. Thank you.